Well, the drones keep laying eggs, but they can't make new queens. So, not the drones, but the worker bees. But anyhow, I'm getting messed up. But we had to introduce another queen to the hive, and that was just amazing to watch. And we're hoping that she will be okay, but there are 2 new queen bees that are about to hatch, so we don't know what's going to happen there. But we do have a lot of honey because Lauren brought us a nice hive with lots of honey in it. So hopefully once they sort everything out, they'll be happy and have enough to eat. Thanks.
Yep.
Is that where some of my honey went, Lauren?
No, this wasn't your honey. This was a whole different hive. The person who's on here, people who are on here, it's not one of hers, but there was another one that produced a queen, and so we put that queen with your honey. So that went to a good place. But no, it's funny, the rest of you guys are worried about feed. Laura's got plenty of honey, but she needs a good queen, and we're trying to work through that issue. I'm gonna save the details of that because it's just so crazy for another call.
Yeah, like I'm dying to know what's going on.
Yeah, we've had some crazy stuff going on there, but it's we're gonna have to go through a whole range of genetics and electromagnetism has been like an issue. And yeah, it's complicated. So we're gonna save that one for a whole different video. So but I'm excited to see how Laura's do, and we're still working on it. I'm gonna come out there this week and check on them. So thanks for the introductions. And so we're gonna go ahead and jump into some new information. Some of it was gone over in the email, and so some of the pictures might look familiar, but feel free to bring in questions. And so let's go ahead and start with native bees. Native bees evolved in Arkansas. There's over 400 species of native bees. And so this isn't a honeybee, right? Not what we're working with, but these bees do produce a small amount of honey. So they've evolved here to be in the climate that they're used to. The food sources that they're used to gathering are all the native plants from Arkansas. But what's interesting about these bees, and most of them throughout the Americas, is they only pollinate a couple hundred feet from where they live. So wherever their colony is, most of them go between about 250 to about 800 feet from that, and that's their pollination zone. Whereas honeybees can go up to 5 miles, and so they generally pollinate about 2.5 miles away from where they are. So they can fly a lot further. And then the amount of honey production, obviously. These bees that are native only produce about a tablespoon or even just a couple drops of honey and gather pollen just to keep themselves and their offspring alive. Whereas honeybees are evolved to produce ample amounts of honey. That's why beekeepers over generations and generations, millennia even, have been using bees as something that's an asset for humans because they produce enough honey that we can harvest it and it doesn't harm the colony. Whereas if we were to go into one of these native beehives and take their honey, they would die off. They wouldn't have any excess to be able to survive the winter. Another difference between honeybees and native bees are how efficient they are. Honeybees can visit flowers and gather the nectar and pollen much more quickly than native bees, and so therefore they can outcompete them. In the pictures here, we have a carpenter bee. So this is the one that has that kind of circle cut into the wood. A lot of you guys might see or have an issue with your carpenter bees because they actually do cause harm to buildings, but they look pretty similar to native bumblebees. Bumblebees and carpenter bees both are larger, and so we see them flying through the air a lot more often. but carpenter bees are a little bit more bare on their bottom end. So they're not as fluffy and furry as a bumblebee. And bumblebees also have 2 or more stripes, whereas carpenter bees generally just have this one section of yellow striping. Mason bees often a lot of times get mistaken for flies because they're not generally yellow. They can be blue or they can be black. But kids back in the day when I was teaching would say, if it's furry, let it scurry. Because mason bees do have a lot of hair, just like bumblebees or honeybees, but they actually live in little tubes like reeds or empty branches of a tree, but they can't build these. That's the difference between carpenter bees and mason bees. Carpenter bees will actually create the holes that they want to dwell in, whereas mason bees must fly and find them in nature. So aside from how they pollinate and where they live, these native bees are essential to the ecosystems in Arkansas and throughout the United States. If these bees aren't there to visit native plants, the ecosystem can collapse. And so they're co-evolved. The plants that are native to Arkansas and the bees that are native to here really need each other and able to survive. So we'll talk a little bit about that at the end. But are there any questions so far about native bees? All right. Like I said, there's hundreds and hundreds of them, so this is just a small sample. What's interesting about a lot of these, like carpenter bees, bumblebees, mason bees, is they do have multiple species that look the same. So a bumblebee won't always have 2 stripes. A carpenter bee won't always dwell in the same size hole. There's a lot of variety, but those are kind of some overarching groups to think about. So let's talk about honeybees. I loved this picture and I had to use it, but this is not how honeybees got to the US. A lot of other insects have been brought to the Americas via boats or via planes, via transportation in general. And a lot of our issues like we have with beetles and with mites were brought over in other instances of transportation, but honeybees were specifically brought over to the US. So honeybees are technically an invasive species. Any of you guys who garden or who have kind of ideas about nature, we know that invasive species we usually want to clear out, right? Native species are not something that we generally want to try to protect in an area. However, through our modern agriculture, we are completely dependent on honeybees. If honeybees die out, we won't all die like a lot of the propaganda says, but as far as our foods in our grocery stores, it would look drastically different. Just thinking about if we were to only eat native foods to Arkansas, right, that would wipe out a lot of different, for their fruits, vegetables, grains that we see at the grocery store. So they're invasive, but we are dependent on them, so we need them now. And because we need them, it's essential that we maintain healthy honeybee hives and healthy populations. So as with other aspects of colonialism, right, explorers and settlers brought these from Europe. So they brought them originally to help with crop yields, just like we use them now in modern agriculture. People will rent beehives, put them all out in their farms, and that increases the yields they have. So whether it's soy or almond or apples, having beehives, honeybee hives on site does help crop yields. But also for these early settlers, it provided an easy source of sweetener. So if you've ever looked into what goes in to produce sugar that we get at the grocery store, a lot of work goes into producing that. So having a natural sweetener that doesn't require the labor and processing that sugarcane does. And then also beeswax. We use it for soap. They also used it for waterproofing. And then obviously candles before we had electricity. And so what we're going to talk about next is about how European and African honeybees are actually the same species. And what's important to know about species is that that means that they can mate. So like a bumblebee and a carpenter bee, if they tried to mate, they would not produce viable offspring. But European and African honeybees can mate, and therefore they can exchange genetics. But they do act differently. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Any questions so far on invasives? All righty. So let's take a look at this graph. The red is the native habitat. So these would be where honeybees are native to growing. So they're evolved to use these habitat ranges, not the yellow. We talked about that European and African honeybees can mate. And so that's this whole red section here. However, with colonialism, we expanded those honeybee colonies to be all throughout the Americas. They're not generally surviving up here in the Arctic areas because it's just too cold and that flowering season is too short. But they were also brought all throughout Asia, Australia. There's also an Asian honeybee. We're going to talk about this in just a second. But the Asian honeybee and then the honeybees that we're used to working with cannot mate. So that's why they stay separate. Even in these areas of Southeast Asia and India, they're both in the same area, but they can't mate with each other. We practiced a couple videos today, or a couple videos before, some pronunciation. So if you want to, even with your mic off, try some pronunciation. Our bees, the A stands for Apis, Apis mellifera. So those are our bees, Apis mellifera. However, the Asian bees that are completely different and cannot mate with are Apis cerana. So Apis mellifera and Apis cerana. Get your practice in. There we go. Any questions so far on the map? All right, well, we're going to start with the Asian honeybee. They look really similar, right? Whenever we've opened up the hives, this is pretty much what you all's hives look like and what Axel's will look like in the future. We've got our hexagonal honeycomb. They're depositing honey. We've got a queen right here. But what's interesting is their stripes. They almost have a highlight on them. So they're a little bit more vibrant. Like, I think they're beautiful. If we could breed with them, that'd be fun. But their yellow stripes do have an extra little highlight that looks different. And then they have an extra stripe. So if we were to count the yellow, it'd be 1, 2, 3, 4 stripes, whereas our bees generally have 3. So they are different species. They can't mate. Their stripes and their coloring are how we can tell the difference. But they also have a difference in how their brood looks. And I know, Blanca, you were with me at the state conference where they used this photo too. And so I totally borrowed it and found this article online to copy from. But what's cool about the Asian honeybee is whenever they're making brood, and these are drone brood, they come to a tip and then it has a little air hole. For those of you guys who have looked in the hive and we've been able to see drone brood generally sticks up kind of like an eraser. And so it doesn't lay flat when there's a young bee developing in it. It kind of sticks up because that drone, that male, is a little bit larger. But what's cool about these Asian honeybees is they actually come to a point, and then this is an air hole. And what happens is if the pupa that are developing in there are infected with mites, they can smell it. A lot of times our bees can too, and they'll start to clean it out. But what's interesting is that if they smell mites growing in here and infecting this young bee, they'll just clog that air hole right there. And then the bee will die, but also the mites will die. So they have varroa mites, just like we've been talking about the past couple weeks. But varroa mites aren't as important. They're not as problematic for these Asian honeybees because they have a way to defend themselves from it. So they're able to block that off and then not increase the varroa mite count of the whole hive. They just wait for it to all die and then clean it out. So let's talk about Africanized bees for a second. So this was actually an experiment gone wrong. So some lovely science Somebody should make a video on this, of some kind of horror film or something on science gone wrong. But before we talk about the science experiment, I want to talk about a little bit about the stigma of the name of Africanized bees, because this is something that, especially whenever I got here to Arkansas, people talked about this a lot. When I was beekeeping up in Washington State, we didn't have too many because the climate in Washington is a lot different than here, but then also geography, right? We're a lot further from our southern borders. But the stigma of the name with this, an Africanized bee basically just means an overly protective bee. So they're really defensive of their hive. And so when people say that a hive, like, oh, be careful because you might get some Africanized bees, they're basically saying that if you get into the honeycomb or go into the hive, they're more defensive than what we're used to. So if we were to go back to the map, I'm going to take us back for a second and think about, these bees are the same species, but they have vastly different resources, right? Up here is much more temperate forest. So there's a lot more plants year round. There's a lot more water year round. Whereas if we look at the climate of a lot of Eastern Africa, it's more dry. And so the bees that evolved in this African region are just more protective of the resources they have. We're going to talk about they have some positives as well, but one downside, right, if you're a beekeeper and you need to go into the hive to be able to check on them and maintain them, and those bees are really defensive, that's going to lead to more stings. Whereas these European bees are much more docile, they're not as protective of their colony nor their honey, and so they're a lot easier for beekeepers to work with. So especially whenever we're talking about swarms in trees, or if people call and need bees removed from a home, there's a lot of discussion in the beekeeping community, and you'll see a lot of articles online about Africanized bees. And there's no test that any beekeepers are doing to determine, like, oh, this bee has been bred with African lineage, like it's bred with African bees. There's no test for that. They're basically just saying if it's overly defensive, that they're concerned about that. So that's just something I want to talk about with the name, because especially when we talk about that beekeeping in the Americas started from colonialism, then you add in, you Google what a beekeeper looks like. It's generally, right, like a white dominated profession. And even like if we go into like YouTube and Google beekeeping videos, there's not a lot of people of color doing beekeeping in the United States. And so when we see videos and articles all the time talking about watching out for Africanized bees, it's even more of a turnoff for some people. So I really like talking about kind of why people are calling them Africanized, and they're just saying aggressive bees, which would be a easier term to use. So let's talk about the experiment. In the 1950s, scientists brought over some colonies from East African lowland areas. And what's cool is that East African bees actually produce more honey. So they're defensive, right? But that actually leads to better yields at the end of the year. So what these researchers' idea was to breed them. Just like we've done with horses, with all of our livestock, with dogs, right? Selective breeding allows us to bring in some genetics. We look at the offspring whenever mating happens, and then we select which bees we want to continue and mate again. So what the idea was to take these African bees, take these European bees that we've been using in the colonies for hundreds of years, breed them, and then select which queen bees produced a lot of honey, but that weren't as defensive over their hive. So then they would eliminate the ones that were overly defensive, eliminate the ones that were weaker honey producers, and then breed this special subspecies of bees. And you see this all the time online. If you ever try to buy packages of bees, you'll see like Carniolan, which is a type, Italian, they have Russian bees, they've got Hawaiian bees. There's all kinds of these different breeds of bees that people have produced by selecting which queens are the best and breeding them over time. But of course, like most science experiments, we can't control nature that well. Several colonies of these East African bees escaped and they just started mating in the wild. And so this was in Brazil in the 50s, but since then they've mated and migrated, and they're all the way up here in the United States. So there's no way to do a genetic test to see if they're from the African continent, but if there's any aggressive defensive bees, they're generally categorized as Africanized. Are there any questions so far on the Asian or the African bees?
I have one. Did you know why we don't use the Asian if it's easier to keep pyramid type, instead of the European?
So I don't know why the US hasn't, but I did research because they're right by Australia. And so a lot of them did get brought into Australia within the past couple decades. And it's become a big issue because based on the map, let me bring it back. So Australia already has the honeybees that we're used to. And the articles I was reading is that once the Asian honeybees came in, they even were doing a better job than the European honeybees that we're used to. And so when we think about there being native pollinators, and then these European bees are coming in and out competing the native bees, and then you have Asian bees that come in and even outcompete the European bees. I think that's the fear in bringing them to the US, is that they're going to become even more successful, which obviously from beekeeping side, if you want honey and you want healthy bees, seems great. But I mean, we talk about a lot, especially in Calm and Confidence, that we want to support all pollinators, right? Our goal at the end of the day isn't to just be drowning in honey and try to, make the most amount we can. It's about making sure that the ecosystems stay sustainable and that we can use honeybees, but they're not going to outcompete the native bees. So I think that's probably why they haven't been brought in, is that it probably would be good for the beekeeping community, but the populations as a whole, when we talk about like the decline of other insects, I'm assuming. I haven't researched it, Blanca. So if you want to, I'd love to see some articles that you find. But that's what I did find about those Asian honeybees, is that they're really successful. And so they outcompete. It wouldn't surprise me if some farmers try to sneak some in somehow, though. But they don't mate either, right? So there's no way to go in and breed them and say, oh, whoops, these European mated with these Asian bees.
No, but what I'm thinking is, or you use one or the other.
Yep.
That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, and now, I mean, I get calls. I probably get 3 phone calls a week of people with beehives in their walls. Like, there are so many loose honeybees in the area that there's no way that we would be able to like get rid of them to bring in a new type. It astounds me how many, and that's where we just really try to stay on our hives, to where if they swarm, we've climbed like 40-foot trees to get them back, because I really don't want to be a part of that problem of them landing in people's, eaves of their house, or they land in places that it's just really hard to get to. So any other questions on Asian or African bees? Okie doke. Well, we're just going to kind of finish up with some kind of what to do's. So with any hives that reproduce, anytime there's a new queen, she has her own personality. So whether she was bred, whether she mated with a drone that was actually from a hive that came originally from Africa, possibly she's mating with any drones that she can when she flies. And so when she starts to lay workers, and if she lays another queen, they have their own personality. And so we talked a lot at the state conference about breeding bees that are really strong, that do a good job. So if a hive is extremely unfriendly, we would need to eliminate it. And by eliminate it, I just mean requeen. And requeen can just be going in and taking the queen out of the hive, Luckily, I haven't had to do this. We've always been able to calm the queen down. There's usually some kind of pest problem or some kind of problem in the hive, but that's why she's angry. And if we solve that problem, then she calms down a lot. But if there was a queen that was overly aggressive, we can just squish her, and then the worker bees will create another queen, and then we wait to see how her attitude is. Or we could introduce a queen from another hive that we know is friendly. But generally what we do as far as Calm and Confidence goes is we move the hive. So if there is a hive that's more aggressive, I don't like to place those hives in an area where there's going to be a lot of children or a lot of neighbors. And so if it is a little bit more of a testy hive, is how I would like to describe that queen, we move her out to the country. So a lot of people who have a big pasture, who don't have a lot of pets, who are going to be right up on the hive. That's a way that we can keep the hive alive, and we don't have to exterminate that queen, but we can remove her from a little neighborhood area or an area with a lot of children. So we can requeen and get a new queen for the hive, or we can move it to an area that's just better. And then another thing that we'll do in the spring is we'll reproduce the strong hives. So if any of you guys have seen my spreadsheets, I keep like ample notes on all the hives. And so we select which ones are producing the most honey, which have the least amount of mites, and then have that kind of friendly, easy to visit, easy to inspect personality, and then breed from there. At the state conference, I talked a lot about breeding varroa mite resistant bees, so ones that we're not having to do a lot of tests from. And so that's an aspect. Like Blanca's hive is a good example because it's testy. I swear that thing stings me every time, but they're good producers, and we didn't even mite test them because I was too afraid. I didn't want to get stung more. And so I was like, we'll just treat them. But in the spring, we will test them for mites and see how well they're doing. So a little bit on the testy side. So it's not going to be something I put in that's going to be working with a lot of kids. It's a great producer, but then we will test it for mites to see if they're a hive that naturally has a really clean, low mite load. And then the last thing that we do, and this is me, but this is also in partnership with you guys, is promoting all pollinators by planting native flowers, right? Letting things actually go to flower. So even if you have some dandelions in the yard, even if it's just an area that you let dandelions go, but just kind of a low mow area, and spreading our hives out. What I really don't like, and we're going to talk about this in 2 weeks at our next call, is when people just cram bees onto a site. And I get that beekeeping is a profession and people need to pay their bills, and I understand that. But when you're placing dozens or hundreds of beehives on one field, you are absolutely outcompeting all the native bees, right? So butterflies, carpenter bees, mason bees, moths, flies, beetles, all of them need to be able to access these plants for food. And with honeybees being so efficient, if we do really heavily populate an area, that's a decline for all other pollinators in that area. So I really like working with all of you guys by placing a hive or two at each site and getting people, you know, you're producing your own honey, you're getting to learn a hobby, you're getting to interact with nature, but it's not at the expense of other species in the ecosystem. And so those are kind of the 3 strategies that we're using for Calm and Confidence. Damara?
My question is, will you go over at some point, like as we start preparing for spring, like things we could plant around our hive or on our property to make this, you know, to make it more suitable for them?
Yeah, I have lists through like the Audubon Society and the Master Gardeners, and I'll share that. I was going to share it. I always get excited when I get these resources, and then I'm like, Lauren, pause, because it's October, and while some of them need to be kind of sown this time of year, most of them don't. And so, because if I send it to you now, it's just going to get lost in the ether of your inbox. And so I'm waiting until later to send that out. But yes, good question. And is that Marthella I see with a raised hand?
Yes, that's Marthella.
Hey.
Questions. The first question kind of goes back to the Asian, Africanized European bees.
Mhm.
So my question is, if you have a hive of European bees that are aggressive, do they then become Africanized bees?
And welcome to my thoughts, because there's no test. Here, I'm gonna mute you for a second, Marthella, just 'cause I'm hearing an echo. Because based on common vernacular, Africanized bees just mean protective bees, right? And so if you're going to a hive and you're talking to beekeepers in the community, they would say, oh, that was an Africanized bee, right? That was an Africanized queen. But we're not doing any, like, what's the ancestry.com? Like, no one's testing to find out where these bees are from. They're generalizing. And like I said, going back to it, like, I think because beekeeping in general is such a white dominated space, there's a lot of things that get said that I like to push back a little bit on. Like that all bee suits have to be white. That if you're not wearing white, you're going to get attacked by bees. Like where, like what? Like I understand that, you know, evolution, that different predators that come to hives, whether it's raccoons or bears and things like that, that they have a darker, but like I've never had any hive act different to me based on the color shirt I'm wearing. And so I think there's little tidbits of information that, you know, maybe there's some bit of truth somewhere in someone's anecdotal information, but I have not seen any kind of definitive ways that if a hive is aggressive, it is Africanized, you know. I like the furry. I almost see like when I'm wearing pollinator colors, like if I'm out there wearing yellow or something like that, like they're all on you. And so if anything, I would be saying like, don't wear a lot of that because then you're just covered in them. But yeah, so I hear you, Marthella, and your pinks. So keep going. If you have another question, I can't unmute you.
So the second question had to do with just placing a huge number of hives in one area, one space. I don't know why I have this echo. I'm sorry, but so I was speaking with another beekeeper, and they have like 125 hives. I'm thinking in a space. And he just kept talking to me about the how aggressive the bees were, and and they have to be so careful, so they don't want to bring anyone that's not in their group into the hive area.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if the bees are aggressive like that because of that. And I really want to ask him, hey, do you have some bees from Africa? Are your bees Africanized? So, you know, I was asking, I think, if that's the reason why that, you know, with them being more aggressive like that, because they're a bigger swarm and a bigger group of boxes there in that one concentrated area.
I would say that just when you think about normal ecosystems and normal population dynamics, and I you know, biology person here, I love this stuff, but anytime you have a large population of any one species, they're going to compete with each other much more, right? Like we all can understand that. My dad at his site, he generally has between 4 and 7 hives. But his hives are aggressive. Like he goes out there completely suited up. And I took one of his hives last year and moved it outside of town to one of my sites. And it took about 6 months, but they calmed down so much to where we can go out there now with just a veil. But every time at the beginning, they were really aggressive and they would sting us several times. But when you think about it, like all those bees are looking at each other as competitors too. And so when it starts to get this time of year or earlier in the summer where there's not a lot of plants for them to pollinate, like they're looking at each other as prey as well. Not necessarily like they're going to consume the bees, but if there's a weak hive, they're going to find a way to get in there and start robbing and stealing the honey, or getting into the feeder and stealing that feed. And so, yeah, I mean, if he's got hundreds or over 100 on a site, I bet they're testy. Like, they don't want anybody coming in that hive.
So what you're saying is more is not merrier?
Exactly, right? Because each of these hives is their own, what am I looking for? Their own family, right? Their own population there. And so if a hive is getting big, that's not a bad sign, right? That's just a really healthy, hopefully healthy, but just really productive hive. But if you're having a lot of different queens, they're all competing with each other instead of all supporting each other.
So then really it's the queens that are directing their bees to kick ass, because they're trying to, you know, preserve their tribe and keep everything cool.
Yeah, because I mean, they're looking out for their own lineage, right? That's what I think is so cool about working with honeybees. It's all about the genetics. Like with Laura's problem, they're not getting a successful queen to lay eggs. They start producing a massive amount of drones, right? The workers just start kicking these drones out. And evolutionarily, if they can get a couple of these drones to go mate with some other queens, their genetic lineage lives on. Like, they know the hive's going to die. Without a queen, like, they can't exist. But if they can churn out enough males to go mate out with other queens, their lineage of a family is going to live on. Whereas what you're talking about, Marthella, these are all different families, right? We got all of them that are all going to the same plants, because none of them can, I mean, maybe a tidbit, some of them can fly a little bit further, but that 2.5, 3 miles around that site, there's a finite amount of flowers, there's a finite amount of space, and they're all going to the same resources. But it's not all coming back to the same hive. It's all going to separate hives.
So I have one more question, and then I'm gonna stop talking. But this is back to the Asian, African, and European bees. So all of those different groups of bees have different stripes to identify them. Am I saying that right? They have their different, you know, like you said, our bees have 3 yellow stripes. Other bees have like the 4 yellow stripes or whatever.
Yeah, and I mean, like when we talk about the bumblebees and the carpenter bees, but it's not only based on stripes. Like, because even bumblebees, there's a variety. I saw one Google image when I was making this presentation that had like 10 different configurations on how their stripes can be, right? And even whenever we look at like your bees, even if we were to just go through that hive, they have different dads, right? That queen would have mated with somewhere between like 8 and let's say 14 different drones when she went to go mate. And so a lot of them have different dads. And so even in the same hive, they'll have different stripe colors. They're going to have the same number of stripes, but some might be more golden, some might be more brown, some might be vibrant yellow, because they do have some different parents.
So then technically you really can identify if it's a European or African or Asian bee really by the stripes. So then you identify the bee by their either calm or aggressive behavior.
Well, the only difference in that, yes, between I'm going to go back to the map here. Between when we're talking about this red area, any bees from Europe and Africa, you're not going to be able to tell. They have the same stripes, they have the same variety of coloring. But these Asian bees, they cannot mate with the European or African bees. So these bees in this picture where we're saying it has an extra stripe, those bees cannot mate with these that are from, so all the bees in the red and the yellow, cannot mate with any in the blue. Those blue highlights right here have that extra stripe, and they're the ones that build their comb with a little hole over the pupa. But as far as all of these African and European bees, and then once colonialism spread them all throughout the rest of the globe, these can all mate with each other, but these blue cannot mate.
Okay, so the yellow bees are mixed breed bees. Is that right?
More or less. Whenever I know you got on a little bit late, when colonists, when we're talking about colonialism, right, they were taking them specifically from Europe because these bees are just more docile because of the native area they're from. There's more water in that area. It's more temperate so that there's plants year round. Whereas in this Eastern Africa that they were talking about, that's where they brought the bees from, it's more arid. And so these bees from that area are more competitive because there's not as much food year round. There's not as much water year round. And that's what makes these more defensive on their hive. So as far as the imported area, all this yellow, they were generally importing them from Europe, but they have been crossbred. There's definitely been mixing throughout the past. In Brazil, they were brought over in 1950s. So since then, they've moved all the way from Brazil all the way up into the United States. I didn't look at how many of the African bees have spread through Asia or down into Australia, but I mean, they're landlocked. So that would have been a really easy migration for African bees as well. They could have done that without humans.
So Lauren, have you ever seen Asian honeybees? Like, are they here?
No. Not that I've read. If anybody's seen anything different, like I said, when I was looking at the Asian honeybees, they haven't been brought here. They have been brought down into Australia, and they were having those issues. But
like shipping containers and like global economy, like things would naturally happen, I would think. But that's kind of,
yeah, but bees are a little tricky on that though, because like the beetles that we have and the mites, they've come over from other areas. They've hitched a ride. But as far as a whole colony, like,
yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, but as always, guys, this has been a fun one. The next one in 2 weeks, we're going to talk about kind of modern agriculture's impact on bees. So the email kind of touched on that, but we'll expand on it. And then we are going to have Mead Fest in about a week and a half, which is in collaboration with Whitewater Tavern. They're going to host us. And so we did a mead class for Father's Day, and it was a big success. And so if anybody wants to use our honey, our local honey, and make some mead, you'll get to take it home, and it'll be ready for in time for the holidays. So you get some nice homemade alcohol. Arkansas style.
Honey moonshine.
Exactly. Yeah, it's definitely stronger than wine or beer, that's for sure.
Is there anything going on in Rose City that we need to know about?
Right now, no. Right now, we are working on renovations. And so now through January, February, we're going to do a lot of renovations and kind of send out if people want to come to work days. And in January, February, I'll start doing some classes on how to build the frames and getting ready for spring, because we'll start adding boxes starting in February and March. Yep. Hey, Ash. I love people getting on at work. This is lovely. All right. Well, if you have any questions just in general, feel free to stay on here for a second and ask me or shoot me an email. But we will get together in 2 weeks at 7 p.m. And I have started recording these for people who want to go back and listen to a part again.
Okay, and with your PowerPoint, is that going to be shared in the email?
I can. I haven't included it, but it's always good to get feedback, so I can include that.
Well, I would like to at least have Annalise and Malachi to look at the PowerPoint since they weren't on with me tonight. And then I can help to kind of, kind of talk to them about some of the things that you talked about tonight. And then we can go and start trying to see if we can count the stripes on our bees.
Yeah, and looking for variety. It's cool to see diversity in the hive.
I think we have European bees.
Oh, for sure.
At our site.
I don't think any of the bees I've worked with since getting here or in my experience over the past 8 or 9 years, I've never had any of them that I would consider like overly aggressive to where they couldn't be worked with, right? And that's why people eliminate them, is because they're so defensive that you can't even get into the hive. Other people swear they've encountered it, but so I'm sure that it does exist, but I have not experienced it.
Could it also be that even though they're genetically, Africanized or whatever you want to call it, that since there's not such a, since there is more of a plethora of resources, maybe they're not as aggressive as they're known to be, possibly?
Exactly right. And then like we're talking about, like Marcella brought up, even if you're a European honeybee, but you're in an environment where you're having to compete for everything, then technically don't you have the characteristics of some of that? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Patrice, do you want to talk about how you had to eliminate it? What method you used? Oh, maybe. There you go.
Yeah, I had, it's probably been 10 years. I had a really, really aggressive hive. We had to like run really far and like jump in a lake to get away from it. It was terrible. And I honestly can't remember every detail of it, but I think it involves like frozen carbon dioxide,
Yeah.
and we had to like euthanize it, like completely encapsulate the hive. But it was like the worst hive that I've ever managed, and it was not manageable.
Yeah.
Had
That's
a
what
lot
I've
of
heard
honey.
is,
That was amazing.
oh yeah,
But totally Africanized.
just overly aggressive and
Bees at
defensive.
in a friend's yard, and it was not sustainable. It was not good. I think it involved like putting some kind of thing that would like on our car, and we could drive away and make it all like, it was very scary.
I've heard that people use dry ice, like you would get at Halloween or, at a school dance or something, and then you use that because it produces carbon dioxide, and so it suffocates them. I've also heard people just take the whole hive and put it in a freezer.
Yeah, we didn't have a freezer, and I didn't want to go near them. I've never had that bad of a hive. It's been 10 years since then.
If I can ask Patrice, was it a single hive? Was it like several hives in one space? Was it like close to some power lines? Was there any other, are there any other factors that caused the bees to become aggressive?
It was just, it's been 10 years. It was one beehive in one bee yard. The other hives were not aggressive like that. And it was just like a hive we could not work. I've had other hives that were pretty aggressive like that, good honey producers, but none that you had to run like a half a mile away from the hive to get away from. This one, like, you could not work.
Was it a swarm or was it a new queen?
Honestly, it's been too long. I honestly don't remember. I really don't remember.
She just remembers her trauma of running.
It was really difficult to make the decision to euthanize that hive because we were pretty new beekeepers then. And I mean, I've had other hives aggressive like that, like in the last couple years, and that I would just like go in knowing like I would get stung and wear like all of my protective equipment. But that one was the worst ever. And but that one's gone. I
Yeah.
really think if I had gotten them tested, they would have been comeback testing Africanized.
Mm-hmm.
The other ones I've dealt with were just like more aggressive, not like definitively that way.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, I appreciate you guys hopping on here and sharing questions, sharing experiences, and I hope to see you guys again in 2 weeks for a little bit different, but still kind of talking about this time of year, just mites and genetics and how to make sure that our bees are going into winter doing their best. Okay. All righty. Well, it was good to see you guys. Thank you, Patrice. And who else was new? Ash getting on here. This was exciting. So keep them coming, new people. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Hey, Lauren, question.
Yep.
What needs to happen with us now?
Like with you being out of feed and me spending tomorrow making feed all day.
Oh gosh. Well, I wasn't. Okay, like I was just asking the game plan. Like I know that I'm not. I wasn't really worried about feed. I was more like asking, when do we check to see their progress?
Yeah, I had to come to town, the other day when I filled up your bucket about last week, that was, right? And so I wanted to go back to Jennifer's because hers was having an issue. That's why I came early into town. So I'll come into town again in about a week and a half. And so I'll look at my notes, but I want to say that was going to be the last feed. I think because you just had like another frame or two, right?
We were 2 frames out.
Yep. So I bet that'll be your last bucket. Yeah. So if you're finished, I'll look at my notes to see if we need to meet in the middle or something. But I say we could just call it up quits.
Okay. I just didn't know. I didn't know if we checked them or kind of how that.
Yeah. Wait for me so I can bring the smoker and stuff. It's never fun to open the hive without that.
But I'm not gonna. No, I don't have no.
I know you guys are getting comfortable. Just making sure you're not getting too comfortable.
Oh, too comfortable.
He says he's too. Jacob is too comfortable, as you know.
Yeah.
Jeff.
Yep. Jeff the bee hanging
Yeah.
out with you guys. Yeah. Just hold on to the bucket and we'll come to town soon and
No
grab
worries.
that. Cool.
Alrighty.
Right. Thank you.
For sure, for sure. And I'll see you later this week, Laura. I'm gonna come and check your hive in the next like couple days. I think we're getting rain again at the end of the week, so I'm gonna come out there soon.
Right. And I need to get my story straight. I really missed.
No, it's been complicated, so you're all good.
No, but I was, anyhow.
No,
Thank
you're
you.
fine. Yeah, good to see you.
See you.
Well, Patrice, I'm excited to brainstorm with you sometime. Your email about upcoming stuff. And Ash, thanks for joining.